Good afternoon and welcome to the Rockefeller Center. My name is Ron Scheiko. I'm the Associate Director for Curricular and Research Programs here at the Center. And it is my pleasure today to introduce our featured speaker, Professor Mark Kleiman. Professor Kleiman is one of our nation's leading authorities on drug policy. He has reached this level of notoriety through his academic work as well as through his real-world engagement in the public policy-making process at the federal, state, local, and international levels. A true pracademic, that is a practitioner and an academic, Professor Kleiman is not one of those ivory tower pontificators. He has wrestled with the real-world ramifications of drugs and their usage in American society and around the world, and is well aware of the complexities of the intersection between policy and politics. This year, while much attention is given to the contest for President of the United States, voters in Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Massachusetts, Arkansas, and Montana will make choices in the voting booth in November that will have a direct impact on the role of drugs in their states. Professor Kleiman's academic work on drugs and drug policy in the United States continues to be influential in these real-world debates that often lead to electoral initiatives. He has written numerous books and countless articles on the topic. His path-breaking books include Marijuana, Costs of Abuse, Costs of Control, Against Excess, Drug Policy for Results, When Brute Force Fails, How to Have Less Crime and Less Punishment, and his best-selling Drugs and Drug Policy, What Everyone Needs to Know. Of drugs and drugs policy, 2005 Nobel laureate in economics Thomas Schelling said the following: "It is, quote, a product of genius. In form and content, more than 200 questions, all relevant and urgent, with succinct and lucid answers. When I started the book, I had strong opinions on many of the topics it covered. Again and again, every time the book came in conflict with my own beliefs, the authors changed my mind. If you care about drugs, you need to read this book. If you don't, read it anyway, just to see how it is done." Professor Kleiman's most recent book, Like Drugs and Drugs Policy, is published by Oxford University Press. It is entitled Marijuana Legalization, What Everyone Needs to Know. Already this book is garnering wide praise. Professor Kleiman's academic home is at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Policy, where he's a professor of public policy. Today, however, Professor Kleiman comes to us from the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia, where he is currently a visiting professor of public policy. Also this year, Professor Kleiman is a visiting fellow at the National Institute of Justice. A magna cum laude graduate of Harvard College, Professor Kleiman holds a master's degree in public policy and a PhD from the Kennedy School at Harvard. We at the Rockefeller Center are thrilled to have Professor Kleiman here on campus. He has already met with students in Professor Whalen's Policy 20 class earlier today and has interacted with a number of faculty members here as well. We now welcome Professor Kleiman to speak to us on which drugs should be legal, how legal should they be. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Professor Kleiman.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. But it contained one small piece of false advertising. Okay. It's not my intention to speak to you in the sense that I have a prepared text. I'd like to make this interactive from the beginning. So, what drugs should be legalized and how legal should they be? I mean, I should say this much. The second part of the title refers to the fact that deciding to legalize a drug is actually a kind of non-decision until you've decided what's going to replace prohibition as the new set of rules that apply. So think about all the questions we'd have to answer about a drug we had decided to legalize. Who can buy it? Anybody, any age? Just any restrictions on prior behavior? At what price? Do we want to tax it heavily? Who can sell it? In what quantity? At what times and places? With how much marketing? What are the rules on what the behavior of people is under the influence? Are they allowed to drive? Are they allowed to operate heavy equipment? Are they allowed to be on duty as, say, police officers? Now, those may seem like silly questions until you consider that caffeine is a drug and a rather potent one. Right? So, caffeine's currently legal. There are essentially no restrictions on buying it selling it or using it, except in some places labeling restrictions. Right? So some places you actually have to put caffeine on the label. I was very surprised to discover that orange soda has lots of caffeine in it, or at least many orange sodas do, until a friend of mine said, oh yes, that's programmer food. And during a period when I was trying to do without stimulants, that was actually a rather unpleasant surprise. All right, so caffeine's legal. Should we leave it legal? Should caffeine be a legal drug? And if we leave it legal, do we want to put any restrictions on it at all? Or are we happy with what we have? Does the word Four Loko ring a bell? I see some knowing looks. So what's Four Loko? It's an energy drink. They say it's virtually pure caffeine. And there's a question about whether that's really a good idea to have very highly caffeinated beverages available. Actually, there's one restriction now on caffeine. You can't put caffeine in beer. So my good friend David Kennedy, who's invented lots of important ideas in criminal justice, passed up an opportunity to get rich when he invented the idea of caffeinated beer about 15 years ago. He was going to call it whipsaw. Friends don't let friends go to sleep drunk. And then, of course, once we had whipsaw, we could extend the line to decaffeinated whipsaw. And of course, if you added Valium instead of caffeine to the beer, then you'd have coping saw. But anyway, but in fact, the Food and Drug Administration decided that you weren't allowed to add caffeine to beer. Possibly a prudent decision, though of course there's nothing that keeps you from buying a bottle of caffeine tablets to take with your beer, or dissolving a caffeine tablet in your beer, or having a cup of coffee with your beer. So even with caffeine, it's not fully legal. There are some things you're not allowed to do with it. All right, but that's probably no place we're actually going to go. How about tobacco? Should we legalize tobacco? No, I see a clear no here. Does somebody have the mic? So it already is, but hang on a second. Wait for the mic to show up. This room has such good acoustics that you can actually do without, but no, these are cordless. So you say no. We shouldn't keep tobacco legal. Why not?
I just think it causes too many side effects, injurious to the body.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I am not a smoker, but I'm so subject to tobacco, secondhand tobacco and so forth, and it could cause me, especially cancerous things, and that they should be regulated in some way. I know they do, at least supposedly, under 18, I think I'm not supposed to be able to purchase it, but that will be the day.
Right. All right, so several ideas in that comment, right? First thing is, we might want to regulate a drug or even prohibit it because it damages the people who use it. Or we might want to regulate it or prohibit it because it damages other people. Damages other people. Secondhand smoke's an example. We're thinking about alcohol. We wouldn't think about secondhand alcohol fumes much. What we think about if we're talking about alcohol? Crime.
Drunk driving.
Right. So with alcohol, it's the act of consumption that might damage somebody else. With alcohol, it's what people do when they're under the influence. So either of those might be a good reason to put legal limits on something. Folks, there are lots of seats down front. I know there's a taboo on sitting down front, but you're certainly welcome to join the merry throng. And I promise I won't ask you any questions. The third idea that was in the answer was, well, even if it were okay for adults, In fact, if we make something legally available to adults, children are going to get it. And most people, right? So what's the argument against regulating behavior that simply damages the people who engage in it? Right? Does everybody here agree that if we discover that tobacco is bad for your health, we should make it illegal? Who would disagree with that? Okay, so somebody want to give a reason why? No?
You told him you were going to ask him questions.
Huh? Okay, so pass this back. Go ahead.
Basically, in enforcement. Being a historian, I've studied the Prohibition experiment of the 1920s, and that didn't do too well. And you can grow tobacco as on the out in the backyard, or as well as you can pot. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you'll be getting to pot, but
Right. So yes, we could ban tobacco, and then we'd have to worry about enforcing the law. Right, so this is the problem of who'll bell the cat. Right, it'd be a nice idea to have the cat wear a bell, but who's going to make it happen?
Also, an argument against banning it would be that we shouldn't interfere with people's private health decisions if they don't affect others.
Right, so that's, right, is there a name associated with that? Right, but the name of a person. Right, that's the argument of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, which was in fact written to oppose alcohol prohibition, which Maine had just passed. That was the origin of that book, was a protest against the Maine temperance law. Right, so the argument is, look, if somebody's damaging himself, right, he should be allowed to. Why not? Right, that's what it means to have a free society. That means to have a liberal society. Yes, I'd be better off 40 pounds later, but that probably is not something we need to legislate. All right, so couple of different reasons. You notice these are different reasons to look twice before illegalizing a drug. One is that it may not be justified or beneficial to interfere with private choice, even if those choices look unwise to you. And the other is that if you try, somebody's going to break the law. And when they break the law, all sorts of bad things happen, as happened during alcohol prohibition in the 20s. All right, how about a case, is that conclusive? Does that mean we shouldn't think about doing something about tobacco? Pass this down if you would.
There's some evidence to suggest that prohibition doesn't actually reduce use, or at least reduce the concentration of use, as opposed to education, specifically talking about smoking when it became widely known that smoking was as harmful as it is. Just the educational aspects of that encouraged a great deal of people. I think the number was as high as 50% to quit, and which is certainly a statistic that prohibition can't claim in any regard.
All right, so the claim here is that prohibition is going to be less successful than education.
Yes.
And the evidence is that without prohibition, we've reduced the prevalence of smoking among adults from something like 50% to something like 23% the last time I checked.
Yeah, and along with that, there's also the argument that when a substance becomes prohibited, it becomes harder for people to get help. That the taboo encourages use in that way.
But notice something curious. If it's true that prohibition is less effective in reducing consumption than education, then you'd expect that some of the currently prohibited drugs would be more widely used than tobacco. Right? But in fact, the prevalence of cocaine use is down around 1.5% of the population. Right? So tobacco is used by 15 times as many people as use cocaine.
They started off with a social acceptability with tobacco that didn't exist with cocaine,
Right.
and also there's the argument that's been displaced.
That
Use has been displaced by other drugs that are also illegal. So we're sharing the field in a way.
Right, they're sharing the field more, but in fact, prevalence of use of all the illicit drugs combined can't get us anywhere near tobacco. If we legalized any of the currently illicit drugs, and the consumption level rose to the tobacco level, that would be a huge increase in the number of users. In fact, the history of prohibition is not quite as is often made out. The best measure of heavy drinking by long-term heavy drinkers is death from cirrhosis, because that usually results only from one thing. Cirrhosis death numbers fell by 2/3 in the early years of Prohibition. So the claim that Prohibition is not effective, even for a drug as widely used as alcohol or tobacco, seems to me hard to sustain. But there's still this different claim that if we made tobacco illegal, we'd have a huge illicit market and we'd be improperly interfering with people's private choices. Let me take a look at the private choices argument for a moment, because I don't think it's quite as transparent as John Stuart Mill thought it was. So a typical person who starts smoking in the United States is 18 years old. Right? And Mill, by the way, did not extend his principle to minors. It's obvious to him that children ought to be ordered around by adults. Now, maybe he wasn't right about that. But it'd be hard to make the strong claim that adolescents have full foresight about the consequences of their actions on the rest of their lives. But in addition, when a 50-year-old man drops dead of a heart attack due to smoking, by the way, heart attacks are a more frequent cause of death for smokers than lung cancer. Is that person the only person affected? Right? Was he doing something that was self-regarding in Mill's sense? Right? He might have a wife, might have children. Right? I mean, I don't know what the willingness to pay is not to be widowed or not to be orphaned, but it's probably not small. And the notion that the 18-year-old who decides to take up smoking and become addicted to it has full foresight about the damage that that decision's going to do to the wife he hasn't met yet and the children who haven't been conceived yet, strikes me as far-fetched. So, particularly with behaviors that tend to somewhat escape self-control. Right? I mean, we all know about bad habits. You know, our mothers all told us not to develop bad habits because they're hard to break. That seems to me was good advice. And the drugs we're going to be talking about are drugs that frequently form bad habits. Now, by frequently, I don't mean more often than not. Only drug I know of that's abused by most of the people who use it is nicotine in the form of tobacco cigarettes. About 90% of American smokers, people who use cigarettes at all, smoke between half a pack and a pack and a half a day. They are habituated. Most pipe smokers, by the way, are not. Right? So it even matters what form you're using. For most of the other drugs, for alcohol, cocaine, cannabis, the rate of developing a bad habit is between 10 and 25% over a lifetime. Right? Not a huge risk, but not a negligible risk either. Right? That's a risk of getting into a situation where you're saying to yourself or to other people, gee, I really need to do less of X. I really need to cut down on my drinking, but I'm having a hard time doing so. Now that's a hard sentence for an economist to parse. But it seems to me it's not a hard sentence for any ordinary human being to parse. We all have bad habits. And if there are things that are bad habit traps, we might want to think about not making them ordinary articles of commerce the way we have with caffeine. How many people here would get a headache if they didn't have their cup of coffee in the morning? Okay, that's a withdrawal syndrome. I thought I'd mention that. Yes, sir. Mike, please.
I just wondered if there's a factor here, the economic factor. As members of a society, we are going to bear, as we go through life, millions of dollars curing, that is, or shepherding toward death, people with lung cancer, people with heart conditions, et cetera, et cetera. Is there an argument to be made, perhaps not of banning, but somehow shifting the responsibility to the people who have decided, oh, I'm going to smoke and enjoy it. Let them pay it.
Okay, very, very strong point. So both insurance policies and progressive taxation make health damaging behavior not entirely self-regarding in Mill's sense, right? I have an interest in the smoking behavior of everybody who has the same insurance plan I do, because I'm going to pay a premium that's based on how sick they get. Now, it's fair to point out that everybody's going to die of something, and it's not clear that smokers die more expensively than the rest of us, but they die a lot earlier. Basic fact about cigarette smoking is that if you're a pack-a-day smoker, your mortality at every age is twice what it would otherwise be. Right? So people are getting sick sooner, which means, discounting means their diseases are more expensive. And of course, they're missing more time from work, probably consuming more health care before they die. So yeah, there's some losses to others from smoking, and there's secondhand smoke damage. I think when you do the arithmetic, the 400,000 deaths a year, which are almost entirely the deaths of smokers, deaths from secondhand smoke are pretty rare, right? If you're a bartender or a cabin attendant or the infant child of a pair of smokers, you're being exposed to enough secondhand smoke to do you some damage. The rest of us, it's an annoyance. It's not really a health damage for those without allergies. But 400,000 deaths a year? If you think about what those people would pay not to die, and lung cancer is not a good way to go, that, it seems to me, is where the losses are concentrated. So we bring it back to the question whether it's legitimate or when it's legitimate to interfere with people's personal choices in their own interest. Again, the John Stuart Mill answer is never. I might want to modify that a little bit. Say, when I do a survey of smokers in the US and ask them, 90% will say that they wish they'd never started. Now, okay, that's the socially desired response, so I got to mark it down a little bit for that. But if 8 out of 10 people who do something report that they wish they hadn't, then I'm at least somewhat prepared to think about whether new people should be prevented from taking what seems very likely to be a bad step. Right, so there's an example in On Liberty where Mill asked the question, imagine that you know that a particular bridge has been blown down by some recent storms, and you see somebody walking toward that bridge. And because of the current windstorm, he can't hear you when you shout at him. Are you interfering with his liberty when you physically restrain him from walking across the bridge, which will not support it? And Mill's answer is no. Liberty is being able to do what you want to do, and he doesn't want to fall into the river. And I would argue that 18-year-old does not want to become a nicotine addict. And again, that's supported by survey data that suggests that most young smokers expect not to be smoking a year from now. That expectation is just wrong. So, my bottom line doesn't have to be your bottom line. There are forms of tobacco that are not carcinogenic. You can grow and cure tobacco in a way that does not produce what are called tobacco-specific nitrosamines. The Food and Drug Administration, under pressure from the anti-smoking groups, has forbidden tobacco companies from advertising that they have a non-carcinogenic tobacco product. That seems to me like a very weird policy. But even if you're not getting any carcinogen, you're still getting lots of heart gases and particulates and ammonia and God knows what else. On the other hand, nicotine is really not very bad for you. Nicotine itself, the active agent in cigarettes, some maybe cardiovascular issue because it's a vasoconstrictor, but there's not much. So the people who chew tobacco, very little health impact unless they get a mouth cancer. And again, there's a version of chewing tobacco that doesn't have any carcinogen in it. So Sweden has a product called snus, which is an oral tobacco product. And it seems to have cut the rate of smoking among Swedish men by half compared to anybody else in Northern Europe, even though Swedish women who do not use snus smoke at the same rate as anybody else in Europe. So that looks like to be a pretty straight substitute for smoking that's non-carcinogenic and doesn't have any other health damage. There's also the e-cigarette. It's basically a crack pipe that vaporizes nicotine. And so you're breathing in pure nicotine fumes. Not, as far as I can tell, bad for your health. And though it doesn't have the flavor of the cigarette, it has all the psychoactive properties of a cigarette, other than the flavor. So I'm prepared to go as far as to say that since we've got lots of forms of tobacco that people use instead of the tobacco cigarette, or lots of forms of nicotine that people can use instead of tobacco cigarette, I would be prepared to ban sales of tobacco cigarettes, make them illegal, and maybe provide maintenance supplies for existing smokers who can't be persuaded to switch to the e-cigarette or the nicotine patch or a pipe or chewing tobacco or whatever it is. Because I think 400,000 deaths a year is just too many to take. And I suspect if you did it that way, you could minimize the illicit market. I could be wrong. We've already got a fairly large illicit market in tobacco just because we tax it a lot. Right? New York City, pack of cigarettes is $12. 2/3 of the cigarettes sold in the South Bronx are illegal cigarettes, mostly smuggled in from North Carolina. So, big point here, deciding not to prohibit cigarettes in New York doesn't mean you don't have an illicit market in cigarettes. But there's a fantasy that we could legalize things and put very tight taxes, high taxes and tight regulations on them, have all the benefits of prohibition and none of the costs, but that's an obvious fallacy. The taxes and the regulations need to be enforced the same way the prohibitions do. All right. Alcohol. Should alcohol be legal? Yes?
Yeah.
100,000 deaths a year. A lot of those non-drinkers. Right? Half the homicides, half the auto accidents, almost all the boating deaths, very large fraction of suicides. Those are drinkers, of course. Almost all house fires turn out to be people who both smoke and drink and fall asleep with a lit cigarette. And so all the costs we take, in flame-resistant fabrics and stuff, all the cost of somebody else's drinking. And an extraordinary amount of crime and incarceration due to crime. Not well known. Alcohol is legal. Arrest for breaking the alcohol laws, not for alcohol-induced bad behavior, which is a very large category. We just look at breaches of the alcohol laws. Now, what would those be? How do you break the alcohol laws, given that alcohol is a legal drug?
Underage drinking.
Underage drinking. Driving while intoxicated. Drunk in public. Sales to minor, which goes with the underage drinking.
Buying on Sunday.
I think people don't get arrested for that. Yeah. So, but if you add up, and drunk and disorderly, right? You add those categories of arrest up, you get to 2.5 million arrests per year in the U.S. It's about 20% of all arrests in the United States are for breaking the alcohol laws, even though alcohol is no longer prohibited. If I did that same calculation for all the illicit drugs combined, all the sales offenses and all the possession offenses, comes to about 1.4 million. John Caulkins, my co-author on the two books that were mentioned last, did the following calculation. Look at people who are clinically dependent, who have habits, for marijuana and for alcohol. And look at arrests as a ratio to dependent users. Comes out to the same number. So legalizing alcohol did not reduce the number of alcohol arrests, though it greatly reduced the violence in the alcohol market, greatly reduced the number of people going to prison, though even then, North Dakota, 1/3 of all state prisoners are in for DUI. DUI is a very, very hard crime to deter people from committing, for one simple reason. Most people know that they should not drink and drive when they're sober. It's only when they're drunk that they forget that they shouldn't drink and drive. And the one thing we know about alcohol intoxication is it greatly reduces the salience of the future in people's decision making. That's the reason it's used for seduction. So you give somebody a drug that reduces his concern for the future, you just reduce his deterrability. And that's the reason that despite ferocious penalties, drunk driving continues to be a very frequent activity. So, but we tried prohibiting alcohol and didn't really have a very good time at that. Though, as I said earlier, it's been 80 years since we de-prohibited alcohol. And I want to ask Zippy the Conehead's question. Are we having fun yet? Right? Alcohol generates more arrests, more death, more dependency, more disease, more injury, more crime than all of the illicit drugs combined. So if alcohol prohibition was nobody's idea of a success, not very easy to argue that alcohol legalization has been such a sterling winner either. We have a competition between two not very attractive policies, or at least two policies with not very attractive results. So let's assume for the moment that we're not going to prohibit alcohol, which of course we're not, and think about what else could we do. So let's look at the how legal should it be question with respect to a drug that's currently illegal. How could we make alcohol less of a problem without going as far as prohibition? Yes, sir?
Increase the price.
Can increase the price, right? Price elasticity of demand, and it turns out the sensitivity of alcohol consumption to price is very high for two groups of people. Poor people, which includes most teenagers, they don't have a lot of disposable income compared to adults, and heavy drinkers who are using a large fraction of their income on alcohol, right? So if you have a drink a day, and we tripled the federal alcohol tax from basically a dime on a beer to 30 cents on a beer. Well, if you have a beer a day, that's 20 cents a day is $70 a year. Rounding error. If you're a 6 beer a day drinker, it's a bigger hit. 50% of all the alcohol consumed in the US is consumed by the 10% of the drinkers who consume 4 or more drinks a day on average year round. Another 30% is the next decile that do 2 to 4 drinks a day. So 80% of the booze goes to, well, only 20% of the alcohol goes to people I would consider social drinkers, who average 2 or fewer drinks a day. So when the alcohol companies tell you they're in favor of responsible drinking, they mean that they intend to go out of business. Because it's not responsible drinkers that built all those breweries. So we could raise the price. If we tripled the federal alcohol tax, we'd bring in about $17 billion a year to the federal government, even adjusting for the fact that there'd be less consumption. And according to Phil Cook at Duke, who's done these numbers, we would reduce fatal auto accidents by about 2,000 a year and homicides by about 1,000 a year. 3,000 lives a year we just saved without putting anybody in jail. Because there's no way that an extra 20 cent alcohol tax is going to generate an illicit market in alcohol. So that is the closest thing I know in public policy to a free lunch. It's a policy that puts minimal burdens on responsible drinkers, puts heavier burdens on people who are drinking too much, and saves a lot of injury both to heavy drinkers and to third parties without generating any need for enforcement, right? I can literally do that with the stroke of a pen. Because the taxes are pretty straightforward to collect because people drink branded alcohol. People are drinking a lot of hard cider, it'd be harder to collect the tax. But if they want something that says Coors on the label, then they're going to have to pay the tax to get it. So if I left you with one thing this afternoon, that would be it. That at a moment where the federal government and the state governments are in fiscal crisis, it is a crime that nobody's looking at booze. Most of the ways we could raise taxes, particularly at the state level, are destructive. Here's a way to raise taxes that actually improves other things as well. So that seems to me obvious. It's of course a political non-starter, given the power of the beer distribution lobby. What else? Other than raising prices, is there anything else we could do about the drinking problem? Yes. Mike, please.
Limit the content of alcohol in drinks. Limit the content, alcohol percentage.
Okay.
If you
And
do
what-
that
with what benefit?
If the price stays the same, it's kind of analogous, I think, to increasing the price.
Oh, sure, but that's just a different way of saying a tax increase. Remember, 2/3 of the alcohol consumed in the US is consumed as beer, the lowest potency form. And there's no evidence that people are less likely to get drunk on beer than they are on anything else. So I'm not sure, other than as a hidden tax increase, potency rules would have much effect. Yes, sir.
States have different ways of regulating the sale of alcohol. So I know in Arizona we have drive-through liquor stores where you can get alcohol till 1 a.m. So I would say probably it's not the best idea if you want to cut down on drunk driving.
Now, New Orleans beats that. They actually have drive-through bars. I'm serious. You can actually, stop at the window and get a drink in your. Yes, there's evidence that regulation on time and places of sale matters, because a lot of drinking is impulsive, right? If people really were, foresightfully planning ahead, of course they could stock up on booze first. But it turns out time and place regulations matter. Not a ton, but some. What else?
More stringent protections on bars selling to intoxicated people.
Okay, so the current rule is that bars can't sell to people who are currently intoxicated, but not clear how well that's enforced.
What about alcohol rations?
Alcohol rations. Okay. Now, this is actually a serious idea. Sweden had it for a long time. And actually the politics of that was interesting. Sweden had it. It was a state monopoly system, and everybody had a card, and you could buy against your ration, and that was as much as you could get that month. And that was ended in the 50s when the Swedish Prohibition Party got some votes, and the socialists who were in charge didn't do so well in that election. And they needed the Prohibition Party to form their coalition. And the Prohibition Party thought it was immoral for the Swedish state to be selling alcohol. So they insisted on going to private distribution. Anyway, it seemed to have worked reasonably well. A creative version of that would be to say, yeah, you've got to, and remember, technically those things are much easier now, right? Visa has no problem regulating my use of credit in, 200 million merchants around the world. So it shouldn't be hard to regulate my use of alcohol. Most of those bars are computerized anyway. A creative version of that would be to say, there's a quota and you set your own, which would allow people who have a problem controlling their drinking to make one decision a month. And a way to allow their long-term planning self to have a little bit of control over their impulsive self. So, yes, we could limit how many people drink too much by limiting how much people drink. Now, you have to worry about somebody providing some of his quota for a friend who wants to drink more heavily. That might be a big enough problem to destroy the idea, or it might not. Notice everything we've talked about so far treats all of the drinkers alike. But in fact, it's only a small minority of drinkers who are repeatedly drunk and disorderly, who commit drunken assault or drunken sexual violence, or drive drunk. Now, what do we do when we convict a drunk driver? What's the sentence? First time DUI.
Off the road for 30 days?
Yeah, you lose your driving license. We don't actually know that the guy is a bad driver. Right? What we know is that he's a bad drinker. When he's drunk, he forgets his civic duty not to drive drunk. So I would propose, instead of taking away his driving license, which doesn't work very well, it turns out, because they just drive suspended, take away his drinking license. So I am a resident of California. Here's my California driver's license. If I were younger than unfortunately I am, the picture would be on the other side of the license, and it would be in 3/4 rather than full face. So if a bartender or a package clerk asks somebody to see his driver's license, he doesn't have to do the arithmetic by looking at the date of birth. If the person is too young to drink, he has a driver's license that shows it on his face. So my proposal is you catch your DUI. Maybe we're going to take away your driving license for a while as well. But when you get it back, it has the non-drinker marking on it, which means that everybody has to be carded. Right? If you want to buy a drink, you're going to have to show some ID. Seems to be not, again, a horrible imposition given what fraction of drinks are paid for with credit cards. You'd have to worry about an illicit market developing to supply the banned drinkers. But notice that compared to the age restriction, a ban on drinking by problem drinkers would have a lot more moral legitimacy. I think people would be much more reluctant to provide a drink for somebody who was a convicted drunk driver than to provide a drink for somebody who was 20 instead of 21. Nobody really thinks it's morally wrong for a 20-year-old to drink. I don't know that you could make that work. I know that it's something well short of prohibition that's much tighter than our current system. If we could take the 5% most problematic drinkers and de-license them, we could probably cut the alcohol problem in half. Now, I can think of 1,000 administrative problems to go with that. None of them as bad as the administrative problems with prohibiting cannabis. Right? So the case for leaving cannabis fully illegal, and allowing problem drinkers to go right on drinking seems to me hard to make out. All right, enough on alcohol. I just want to suggest that short of prohibition, there's a lot we could do with our most problematic, currently illicit drug. All right, marijuana. Right, sort of the obvious candidate for legalization. Pieces of it are happening. There are 3 states this fall that will vote not on medical marijuana, but on full legalization of production and sale for non-medical use. Oregon, which has the most bizarre proposition ever seen. Honest, the proposition has this long set of whereas clauses, and one of the whereas clauses is that whereas the prohibition of marijuana forbids the use of, quote, herb-bearing seed as given to mankind by God in Genesis 1:27, marijuana prohibition is a violation of religious liberty as protected by Oregon Constitution, section number 1235. So my summary of the proposition is it's what you get if you got some Tea Party guy really, really, really stoned. That one's going nowhere, but Washington State and Colorado have much more reasonable pieces of legislation that might actually pass. I think Washington State probably will pass, which will set up a very interesting conflict between federal law and state law. Well, why not nationally? What's the case against making marijuana legal nationally? Just the way alcohol is. It's by many accounts a less dangerous drug. Less toxic physically, somewhat less likely to form a bad habit. It forms a bad habit that's somewhat easier to get out of. I mean, there are some very, very long-term chronic dependent marijuana users, But that's much more rare, much more uncommon than being a chronic long-term drunk. And of course, there's less violence. I mean, marijuana intoxication has lots of bad characteristics, but it very rarely unleashes aggression. So, why not? Sir?
There's no good test for whether you're intoxicated or not?
There's no good test for whether you're intoxicated or not, and therefore?
It's hard to prove someone's driving.
Right. So it'd be hard to enforce the laws against driving under the influence. If the prevalence of cannabis use went up, there'd be a lot of people, at least potentially driving under the influence, and the law couldn't do much about it. And the issue here is that with alcohol, if it's in the blood, it's in the breath. And so the breathalyzer test is a pretty cheap way of figuring out whether somebody's impaired or not. In the case of cannabis, you'd actually have to take a blood sample, which cops are not going to do at the roadside. So that's a serious argument. Then you'd have to ask, well, how bad is stoned driving? Yes?
In my experience, it's the argument against legalizing marijuana simply goes to public perception that, I don't know if it's a generational thing, but marijuana is sort of reefer madness, and alcohol is winked at.
Mm-hmm.
We use alcohol at celebrations, at weddings, in movies and television. If someone is having a bad day, they have a drink so that they
Right.
feel better. But marijuana is verboten, even for, I run into even for medical use.
Mhm.
It's still considered
Right.
taboo.
Right. So if you're thinking about the politics of this, there's a large chunk of the population that just regards cannabis use as evil and weird and wants to suppress it. There's generational change there, right? That opinion is concentrated in at increasingly high ages. So, but here's a harder question. Every culture is defined in part by the drugs it uses. Right? And very few cultures have ever had multiple drugs that people use whenever they wanted to use them. Right? If you look anthropologically, drug use is always very tightly custom bound. And just think about even in American society, there are customs around alcohol use that are not fully observed, but people sort of know they're not supposed to drink when they get up in the morning. Right? That they're not supposed to drink and drive. Right? So we don't have, and there's a set of rituals around alcohol use that somewhat limit the damage. And again, that varies enormously within subcultures. So if you look at Europe, you get two very clear patterns about drinking. You get the Mediterranean pattern, which is mostly wine, mostly with meals, mostly with family, and rarely to get drunk. Now, it's not to say the Italians don't put away an awful lot of alcohol and their livers notice. But Italy does not have a drunken violence problem. The northern pattern, where the north starts about at Paris, is beer and distilled spirits in all male groups to drunkenness. And it's hard to tell whether it's the form of alcohol used or the ethnicity or the religion, because this turns out to be largely the same line as Catholic Protestant, or just the long winter nights up north, right? Every high latitude country has a bad drinking problem because that's the way you get through a 16-hour night. But Northern Europe drinks badly and Southern Europe drinks well. I'm told by people who've spent time among upper middle class people in Australia, where cannabis use is relatively widespread, that the norm of use is passing a joint around before dinner and everybody has a puff. And when an American shows up and goes, he's just regarded as unbelievably rude and vulgar. What, are you trying to get stoned? So one argument is, look, we do not have, in fact, norms of responsible cannabis use, and therefore we should expect a bumpy ride. And a different argument is, well, we're never going to get them unless we normalize the behavior. Yeah.
Back to your earlier question, my concern would be Philip. I don't want to legalize marijuana only because I don't want Philip Morris selling it, and I don't want the government selling it either. And my concern, back to where you were, is that any profit maximizing firm is going to try and set those norms, and I'm
Right.
not real excited about that.
Right. So if, I mean, I actually don't believe the tobacco companies would have any role in the marijuana market for the following reason. I think a lot of their tobacco customers would be horrified to have their normal, sane American behavior identified with that hippie crap. So I think going into the marijuana business would wreck Philip Morris's tobacco business. And I also think that the curse on tobacco would mean that a Philip Morris marijuana product would go absolutely nowhere in the market. But there'd be a marijuana company, and just like a beer company, it would be completely dependent on chronic 8-joint-a-day wake and bake stoners. Because the Saturday night marijuana smoker just isn't using enough to matter. So yeah, I'd be worried about marketing. It's interesting about the state monopoly, right? So New Hampshire's, the home of the state lottery. Absolutely irresponsible, heavy marketing of addictive gambling. And yet we know things that are state monopolies that are handled in a health and safety way and not in a profit maximizing way. It's really hard to tell. A different version of it would be let people grow their own or form co-ops, so no businesses. You could also do a quota. But the fact that you can actually grow your own probably matters a lot for cannabis. A big question here is, if we legalize cannabis, what happens to heavy drinking? The advocates of marijuana legalization will tell you, well, much better to have people get stoned than get drunk. And that's a reasonable thing to say. But how do we know that people are going to get stoned instead of getting drunk, rather than doing both? And the evidence is completely indecisive as to whether the two products are complements or substitutes. And if legalizing pot led to more heavy drinking, it'd be very hard to see any advantage to legalization that would outweigh the damage from additional heavy drinking. Big advantage from legalization is more than 10 million people allowed to do something they like to do and do with no harm to anybody else without breaking the law. That's a big gain. They're suddenly on the right side of the law, possibly better citizens in other ways, getting higher quality, more reliable pot, saving a lot of money, not putting $15 to $30 billion a year into the hands of criminals, not having 800,000 arrests a year, not having 30,000 people behind bars at any one time. Well, those are all pretty big gains. My view is if we legalize cannabis and we only got a doubling in heavy marijuana use, I mean, there are about 3 million people in the US today who, if you do a survey, will report themselves as having a marijuana habit that's interfering with their lives. 3 million people. If that went to 6, that would not be a small social loss. I think it's about the best outcome you could expect from legalization. On the other hand, given all of the costs of illegality, I would say that's probably a good deal unless it increases heavy drinking. But if instead of 6 it went to 9, 12, 15, that's about how many heavy drinkers we have. If we had as many pot smokers as heavy drinkers, and it was so in addition to instead of, would losing the cost of prohibition be a good enough reason to incur that additional damage? Harder to tell. And I want to claim we have no idea until we specify a legal regime and a price and a set of marketing rules, whether we're more likely to get the doubling or the quadrupling. Yes, sir. Or sorry.
I was just going to mention there's also a probability for concern about increasing the rate of cigarette smoking with legalizing pot smoking.
Why do you think that? I hadn't thought about that.
You hadn't thought about that? Well, right now they go together. 50% of the marijuana users smoke cigarettes. Depending on which studies you look at, sometimes cigarettes come first, sometimes marijuana's coming first nowadays. Since the ban on cigarettes has gone high,
Very interesting.
They've cracked down. So, you know, once you break the smoking into the smoking, touching cigarettes, all of a sudden becomes more palatable.
Now,
for
there's a
teens.
question about whether if cannabis were legal, people would smoke it in the sense of burning the leaves and breathing the smoke rather than just getting a vaporizer, which again is much less damaging to health. But you're right, that's certainly a risk. All right. So I'm going to leave, yes, sir.
Isn't it possible to, do you think it'd be possible to lessen the demand or fashionability in smoking marijuana, similar to what's happened in cigarettes?
Hard to imagine that that could go along with legalizing it, right? So illegality,
I mean, if you didn't legalize it, instead tried to just market it, like, it worked for cigarettes, I don't know if you could do it.
all right, so you could try to demarket it.
Yeah.
Right, well, that's what DARE programs do, right? And we get some effect. I don't think we have, I mean, the thing about smoking is, when the anti-smoking campaign started, people didn't know how bad smoking was for you, right? There's just not a lot of bad news about marijuana that still remains to be gotten out there. All right, so I want to leave cannabis as don't know. Just, I mean, if you ask me what I would do, I think I would say let people grow their own or have small not-for-profit co-ops produce it for them. Would that avoid the marketing problem? Maybe. Would that really eliminate the illicit market? Or would people just want to, get from deal? Who knows? Hard to tell. All right. How about cocaine? Right. I mean, so far we're 2/3 of the way into this discussion, and we haven't mentioned at all any of the drugs that lead there to be 500,000 people behind bars in the U.S. Right. We have a shocking incarceration problem in the U.S. 1% of all American adults are behind bars right now. We have more prisoners in the United States than any other country in the world. Not more prisoners per capita. We have more prisoners than China. We have 5 times as many prisoners as we've ever had in the history of this country. And about 20% of that is drug law violation. So we have as many drug law violators behind bars as England and Wales has total people behind bars per capita, and about twice as many as Netherlands, right? Netherlands runs about 70 prisoners per 100,000 population. We run about 750. So, colossal incarceration problem. Again, only a piece of that has to do with the drug war. Those people are in prison as dealers, not users, despite the legalizer propaganda. And they're in prison for overwhelmingly heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, not for cannabis. So, if we wanted to end the drug war, playing around with marijuana is not going to get us anyplace. If we're really concerned about the illicit drug business, about the violence in the illicit drug business, about the incarceration. That's all on the, if you will, hard drugs. So, should we legalize cocaine? Reason 2, reason not to? Why shouldn't we legalize cocaine? Take away $30 billion a year from criminals. What's the downside of legalizing cocaine? Very addictive, and therefore if we legalized it, we'd have more use and more problem use. and more people ruining their lives. And in the case of cocaine, we absolutely know that it's complementary with alcohol. So cocaine legalization would definitely mean more heavy drinking, more combination use of alcohol and cocaine. Now, just as a pharmacological matter, if you drink and use cocaine together, a molecule forms in your bloodstream called cocaethylene. And unlike either alcohol or cocaine alone, you can show in the laboratory with rats that cocaethylene directly generates aggression. So the alcohol-cocaine combination, very, 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 very bad combination. And we know that it would be used, right? The limiting factor on getting drunk is passing out. Cocaine will take care of that problem for you. The big disadvantage of a long cocaine binge is you can't get to sleep. Alcohol will take care of that problem for you. So these are naturally complementary drugs.
Caffeine works that way with alcohol as well.
Yes, not as effectively. Not as effectively. Yeah. But yes, that's the reason there's rum and coke.
There would also be more use probably because it would be a lot cheaper, and that's why people use other stimulants like meth, is because it's so expensive from the risk of, you know,
Right.
criminality.
Right. So cocaine, if it were legal, I should go back to marijuana. Marijuana, if it were legal, would trade at something of 1% of its current illicit price plus whatever the tax we put on it. Cocaine would be more like 10% of the current illicit price. But there'd be a big drop in price in addition to a big increase in availability. And therefore, you'd have to expect a huge increase in consumption and problem use. Yeah?
Who would supply it?
Okay, well, who would supply it? That's an option, right? So Park Davis could supply it, right? I mean, it used to be a pharmaceutical drug, right? And you know, it could be next to the Sudafed in your pharmacy. I don't think anybody's thought through carefully what a legal cocaine dealership would look like. But I do want to claim that all the people who say the drug war is terrible and therefore we have to legalize marijuana are just missing the point, right? The big stake here is cocaine. And cocaine seems to be, along with meth, about the least legalizable drug there is. Now, if I were speaking entirely from the perspective of Mexico or the South Bronx, places that are being devastated by cocaine prohibition, I might say, you know, people have to learn to deal with it. The distributional consequences of prohibition are to benefit mostly white, mostly middle-class neighborhoods, most of the country, and to harm a relatively few poor urban minority neighborhoods that are being devastated both by the abuse of these drugs which are available there and by the dealing. Right? So they're not getting any benefit from prohibition, and they're getting a huge hit from prohibition. While, you know, I don't know what the level of cocaine use is in Hanover, but it's probably not very high. Right? And it would be a lot higher if cocaine were legal. So Hanover would lose from legalization and Harlem would gain. Suggests to me that this is not going to be a politically viable idea anytime soon. All right, but are we stuck with our current cocaine policies? What can we do about cocaine other than making it legal that would reduce the devastation of the drug control effort? Right? About 300,000 of the 500,000 drug prisoners are in there for cocaine dealing. Proposal?
Focus the efforts on preventing it coming into the country?
Which would mean a different kind of enforcement.
Yeah.
Okay.
More international enforcement rather than domestic.
Okay. Let me just say, as somebody who's been working at this, hopeless. Hopeless. The stuff comes into the country at about 10 to 15% of its retail price. There's very little we could do at the supply end that would matter. Somebody in the world is going to supply us with whatever drugs one set of Americans are willing to sell to another set of Americans. Well, one direct way we could reduce the number of people behind bars for cocaine dealing is to arrest fewer of them and hand out fewer long sentences. Right? Think about this as a law enforcement problem for a second. If the police arrest a burglar and put him in prison, and the guy next door who was thinking about going into burglary for a trade or had been doing a little bit of burglary says, ooh, I guess that's really too dangerous, and quits, right? So that's the incapacitation effect, locking somebody away, and the deterrence effect of keeping people out of that activity. We've reduced the number of burglaries. Because neither the guy in prison nor the guy who's been scared away is doing burglaries, and nobody's doing their burglaries for them. There wasn't a queue of people waiting for an apartment to break into. The apartments aren't scarce. The limiting factor in burglaries is burglars. And if I can deter or incapacitate burglars, I can reduce the amount of burglary. Now, let's imagine instead I have an open crack market in a big city. And I arrest one of the 20 crack dealers and put him away and discourage his younger brother from going into crack dealing. What effect have I had on the amount of cocaine sold in that market? None. There were lots of people waiting for those dealer jobs. Many of them people who already have a cocaine dealing conviction, therefore can't get any legitimate job. The volume of cocaine sold is determined by the buyers, not by the sellers. Now, if you had a place that didn't have a cocaine dealer and a cocaine dealer showed up, there'd be value in getting that guy off the street so there's no supply there. But once you have an established mass market, the benefits of more enforcement rather than less enforcement, negligible. So I believe if we had 100,000 drug law violators in prison instead of 500,000, drugs would be no cheaper and no more available than they are today. That's a very straightforward proposition. Police forces across the country are shrinking. Let's shrink the drug part of that activity rather than the predatory crime part of that activity. And let's change the current system where the sentences for drug dealing are frequently longer than the sentences for violent crime. DA caught a large-scale LSD manufacturer, and a federal judge gave him 2 life sentences without parole to be served consecutively, which, if you think about it, is really a good trick. I think it means he has to do his next incarnation in the federal prison. Now, if he just killed somebody, he wouldn't spend that long behind bars. That seems to me both morally and operationally insane. So, massively cut back on the drug enforcement machinery and focus it not on the quantities of drugs moving, but on the side effects of dealing. Violence, corruption, disorder, open street markets that wreck neighborhoods. So we could refocus our drug enforcement, right? Now, so this is a long way from legalizing cocaine. I didn't make anything legal that wasn't legal to start with. You just change the enforcement system, you could enormously reduce the damage that's done by prohibition without much losing the benefit of prohibition in the form of reduced consumption. I saw 2 hands.
What's your opinion on legalizing various psychedelics that might not be as addictive as cocaine?
Okay. Long story. Short answer. Yes, under some version of legalization. Do I think you should be able to go to the 7-Eleven and buy LSD? No. If I can use the technical term, the hallucinogens, LSD, mescaline, DMT, psilocybin, have very different risks than alcohol, tobacco, cocaine. It's an accident that because they're chemicals people put into their body to influence their mind, they get treated legally as if they were sort of the same thing. They're actually radically different. The risks of the hallucinogens, very small addictive risk, almost none, with a single exception of ketamine, which is actually a slightly different category. But LSD, almost no addictive risk, partly because if you take a dose of LSD today and then do it again tomorrow, nothing will happen. It takes your brain a couple of days to be ready to have that experience again. So it's hard to be a daily user of any of these things. That doesn't mean they're safe. The risks of the hallucinogens are people doing stupid things under the influence. Yeah, that urban myth about people thinking they can fly, that's real, that happens. People do jump out of windows thinking they can fly. Or more commonly, just run in front of cars because they're not seeing the car. And so people can get killed or badly hurt as a result of the dumb stuff they do while they're tripping. The other big class of risk is that they can have a very scary experience while they're tripping. And the fact that the experience is imaginary doesn't make it any less scary. And so people can wind up with what is in effect post-traumatic stress from the trauma they experienced in a bad trip. That's the famous flashback story. And again, that's not, most people who have a bad experience can be talked down from it. Most people, even who have to be admitted to the hospital, get released in 24 hours, nothing particularly horrible has happened. But a small number of people really wind up with some serious problems. And there are some people who do manage to develop a bad habit. I hold Timothy Leary in minimum high esteem. But he said something very sensible about LSD. He said, you know, nobody thinks that hitting a golf ball is immoral or even inherently dangerous. But you're not allowed to do it in the middle of the green. Right? If you want to hit a golf ball, you go to a golf club which is set up for that activity, and the golf pro will show you how to do it safely. And that's what he proposed for the hallucinogens, and I think that was substantially correct. There ought to be licensed establishments with lots of liability insurance whose job it is to take care of people who want to have these experiences and get them out safely to themselves and others. This is especially important, in my view, in light of the research that's just come out of Hawkins over the last 3 or 4 years about people who are interested in having a spiritual experience and are given psilocybin as an aid to that. About 2/3 of them have a major mystical experience, which they will report 2 years later as having permanently improved their lives and rank as among the 5 most important things that ever happened to them. Right? That's 8 hours of preparation and 1 afternoon in a room with a couple of guides. Right? It's a pretty big payoff for a pretty small investment. And I think there's actually a religious liberty question about whether people who, want to drop acid and see God shouldn't be allowed to do that, given that their chances of seeing God are pretty high. So that's my view about, they're valuable and dangerous and ought to be given to people who are well selected and well prepared by people who know what the hell they're doing. And at least for your first few experiences, and I'm sure that in this wonderful law-abiding place, nobody would think about using an illegal hallucinogenic drug. But if you happened to do that, do it with a babysitter. Find somebody who's been through the experience, who knows what it's like, who's prepared to spend some time with you beforehand and be locked to you during the experience. And just agree in advance, whatever he says, I'm going to do. Right? That's the way to come out of that thing on the other end, in decent shape. So I think that ought to be permitted. I don't think it'll ever be a mass market activity. I think that's the case where you definitely want the government providing the drugs, or some regulated entity providing the drugs. They're very inexpensive because, again, it's occasional activity. MDMA, ecstasy, is the hard case. The hallucinogens are never going to be a mass market thing. Most people do not want that experience. Though, sorry, I should take that back. It's quite possible that much lower doses would have a much larger potential market, and also considerably less risk. MDMA, a lot of people would want the full experience. And we now know that, despite the early reports, some people do manage to form a pretty bad habit around MDMA, especially in the context of the rave scene. All of those things are probably useful therapeutically. I'm sure MDMA is. And if we get the prejudices out of the way, there's some recent work on PTSD suggesting that MDMA might be a very important, not a drug you take because the drug cures the disease, but an adjunct to therapy. That's all unimportant in terms of the drug war. Almost none of the drug war is about the hallucinogens. That's about the personal liberty issue and about the foregone benefit. I mean, I don't think there's any reason to doubt people's reports of benefit from these things if they could be made available in a safe and responsible way. So, and if we could break this out of the whole drug war question, I think we'd have a much better chance of getting some sort of a reasonable answer. All right. Most of what we said about cocaine applies to methamphetamine only in spades. That's got to be the least legalizable drug ever. The illicit methamphetamine market does a limited amount of damage. Methamphetamine itself does an enormous amount of damage. There's no safe way to use it. So that seems to me like the last thing you'd want to legalize. The opiates are a more complicated question. Unlike the stimulants and unlike alcohol, an opiate abuser is engaging in mostly self-regarding damage. There is nothing more peaceful in the world than a heroin addict who's had his fix. And on the other hand, when you make heroin illegal, heroin addicts or users of other potent opioids, I mean, oxycodone and heroin are essentially pharmacologically equivalent. Those people get to be more dangerous because they need to steal to support their habit. And the problem with the opiates is that the desire is a bottomless pit, right? Like it's the story about Thor's contest with the giantess, where he's supposed to fill a bag, and no matter how much he puts in it, it'll hold more. 5 milligrams of heroin will get any naive user floating pretty thoroughly on the ceiling for a couple of hours. 100 milligrams of heroin would kill anybody in this room. One of the problems with the opiates, very narrow therapeutic index, very narrow range between the effective dose and the lethal dose. And it's unpredictable. In Switzerland, where long-term incorrigible heroin addicts are admitted to a program where they can come to a state-run institution and get as much heroin as they want, as long as they stay there. You know, they have to walk out under their own powers. They got to leave sober. Some of the people in that trial got up to 2 grams a day, 2,000 milligrams of heroin. And they were just being normal, right? That's what they needed to be normal. So, very hard to make the stuff available and not have the habits run out of control. Given that we have substitution drugs, which we don't have for any other class of drugs, right? We got buprenorphine and methadone and LAM, all of which are ways of giving people relief from their opiate craving. That's, I think, the closest we're likely to get to legalizing those things. What we're going to do about the prescription drug abuse problem, I don't have a clue. Right? I mean, this is really a ticking time bomb under our current drug laws. But the volume of opioids used illicitly that originated in the pharmaceutical market is now larger than the volume of strictly illicit opioids. Right, so the kid with his mother's Percodan prescription has now replaced the heroin dealer. And so that's a case where we made the drug legal for medical purposes, and then that turned out to spin out of control. All right. Let me turn it over to you. What haven't we talked about? We ought to talk about. We got 10 minutes. Question down here, question over there.
Is just targeting crime surrounding like the cocaine underworld politically feasible? Or is that under the umbrella of harm reduction that you can't really do?
If you don't call it harm reduction, maybe nobody will notice. So I know at least one major DA's office on the East Coast that asked the police department to make a list of the most violent drug dealers in town. And that's going to be the focus of their prosecution efforts. So yeah, I mean, law enforcement has enormous discretion. The problem is the whole notion of the drug war, right? So the story was told, we've got this drug problem, it's a single problem, it's society threatening. There are three things we do about it. Prevention, treatment, enforcement. So prevention's trying to keep new people from starting. Treatment's trying to help people who currently have a problem to get out of that problem. And enforcement is basically trying to hold the line while prevention and treatment get a chance to work, right? That's the story that was told going back to at least the Nixon days. In that story, enforcement is the supply control effort, and prevention and treatment are the demand control effort. But that assumes that drug law enforcement can actually reduce drug supply. I want to distinguish between two claims that sound like they're the same, but I want to argue are not. One is that prohibition reduces drug consumption. I absolutely believe that. If heroin were legal, there'd be an awful lot of heroin users, and a lot of them would be heroin abusers. Same thing with cocaine, as we've discovered with alcohol. If you're going to prohibit a drug, you need to do some enforcement, or the law's a dead letter. You know, it's Massachusetts, I think it's illegal to bowl on a Sunday, but like, who cares? So you need to enforce the law some, or it's a joke. But beyond the minimum threshold that forces people not to be flagrant about breaking the law, I suspect that increased drug law enforcement does not reduce drug supply very much. So we're asking enforcement to do a job that it can't do. I mean, here's the arithmetic. In 1980, we had 15,000 drug dealers behind bars. Now we have 30 times that many. The price of heroin is down more than 90% over that 30-year period. Price of cocaine is down about 75% over that 30-year period. So we've done the experiment about whether aggressive drug enforcement can raise prices. Looks like it can't. Which means we're asking law enforcement to do a job it can't do. And a job that's outside its core mission, right? Law enforcement is supposed to protect public safety and order, not to protect public health. But the supply side of the drug war is a public health mission. So I think we ought to redirect our law enforcement forces and say to them, look, your job is what it always was, protecting public safety and order. If the drug market gets violent, put a stop to it. If it gets flagrant, put a stop to it. Make it clear that there in fact is a law and that people can be arrested for violating it. But it's not your job to shut down the supply. And that's the way it seems to me we can maintain drug prohibition and not have 500,000 people behind bars. and focus the enforcement activity on the minority of drug dealers, because it's always a minority, that are in fact violent and dangerous people, put them away. In which effort you'd have the support of all the other drug dealers. Sir.
You answered my question.
All right. One more. Or two more. Yep.
Do you think that sentencing could be reformed so that there's more judicial discretion instead of strict limits for years and stuff?
It would be a good idea. At the moment, the politics of it don't allow it. But it's a strange fact that if you look at this year's two National Party platforms, drug policy enters almost not at all. And the biggest current movement on the Republican side around the whole crime and drug issue is a group called Right on Crime, which is calling for an end to mass incarceration. And the head of that effort was Newt Gingrich. When Gingrich became the front runner against Romney, which he was for about 3 weeks, Romney absolutely destroyed him. Hit him with everything. Hit him with multiple wives, hit him with government-sponsored enterprises, hit him with health ethics violation, hit him with colonies on the moon. The one thing Romney's people never mentioned was that Gingrich was online, on a public website, calling for a substantial reduction in the number of Americans behind bars, specifically on the drug side. So the Romney campaign did not think that that position was a vulnerability for Gingrich in a Republican primary. So all of the answers I would have given a year ago about what's not feasible, I'm suddenly raising questions about. I think the collapse in crime rates has transformed the politics of drugs and crime in a way that may make certain kinds of progress possible that weren't possible before.
You mentioned MDMA as a hard case because of its clear potential for therapeutic benefit, but given the potential for abuse if it's fully legalized, how do you feel? You didn't specifically address the legalization of MDMA.
Well, in the case of MDMA, it could be made available for therapeutic use by making it a FDA-approved medicine without changing its availability for non-medical use, particularly because unlike Prozac, where you get a prescription and take it home and take one a day, the therapeutic use of MDMA would be a very small number of sessions with a physician present. So you could legalize MDMA for medical use without ever having a patient have the stuff. So there's a case where we can break out the medical from the recreational entirely, and I hope we will see it approved for PTSD, not soon, but with reasonable speed. There's a different question that an awful lot of people took MDMA and thought it transformed their life, and relatively few of them developed any problem with it, right? Somebody who takes MDMA once has almost no risk of having anything bad happen. It's really an astoundingly safe drug. And it has, unlike the hallucinogens, no bad trip risk. There's just no such thing your first time. Right? The weird thing about MDMA is that your risk of having a bad experience goes up with your experience level. So your 20th MDMA experience is much more likely to be unpleasant than your first. So I think it probably is legalizable for non-medical use. You just have to try to figure out the control system. But that's a case where if you said everybody can have 1 dose a year, that would cover all of the beneficial uses and none of the problem uses. The real issue with the illegal MDMA today is that it's not MDMA. Right? The stuff you buy is ecstasy. I mean, I don't know what the market is around here, but I assume if you bought an ecstasy tab on this campus, your chances of having any MDMA in it at all would be no better than 75%. And your probability of getting pure MDMA would be essentially 0. There'd be other crap in there. You wouldn't know what it was. You wouldn't know how much MDMA you were getting. It's a drug that's extremely sensitive in terms of the volume. So illicit MDMA is a very, very dangerous thing to use. You know, again, that's one I think is clearly legalizable, but not soon. All right, we have run out of time. I'm happy to linger if there are other people who want to ask questions. Thanks for your attention.